Security Committee, and certainly you've been following this very closely. You've been briefed here. I do want to talk to you about Barbara's reporting here on the spread of ISIS. But first, is there anything you can tell us about the San Bernardino attack that maybe you are learning? Have officials been able to rule out that there was anyone else perhaps involved in the planning or even the execution of the attack?
This is priority number one for our men and women in law enforcement, and they're making sure to see if there are any other connections that they can possibly stop. Right now, the evidence suggests that there isn't, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions. Why were they building 19 pipe bombs? Why did they have thousands of ammunition? Was there something else that they were trying to do? But as of right now, it looks like, you know, our law enforcement officials don't see a connection to other groups.
Earlier, I interviewed Senator Angus King of Maine, and he said something that stuck out to me. He said there's this big question about what happened between the attack and this 4-hour gap between the attack and then when this couple got into this altercation with law enforcement and they were killed. Are there any other huge outstanding questions to you that you think are really paramount or priority here?
Well, I think also, how did these two individuals become radicalized? When did it start? We know general timelines. What was that initial contact point? How did that happen? There's still a lot of questions that, if we learn the answers, it's going to help us be able to stop these kinds of things in the future. And how can we tweak our posture on the ground in places around the country?
I know right now the indication seems to be that they didn't have this outside help, but I think people look at this lake that they're essentially dredging, looking for this missing hard drive. There were cell phones that were, smashed and were thrown away nearby. It begs the question, why would they be getting rid of that unless perhaps they're trying to hide from authorities, maybe people that they were in contact with?
Yeah, or were they trying to escape? Did they think that they were going to be able to go somewhere and live their life? What were they going to do? Were they going back to pick up their child that they left off with the grandmother? Did they have a plan of escape? Because, you don't drive around for 4 hours if you don't think you're going to be able to get away or do something else.
Do you have a sense that officials have any threads that they're pulling on that would connect this husband-wife team of killers to other radicalized individuals in the U.S.?
Well, this is the dragnet that law enforcement is looking to try to uncover. The information now is who are all these people, this Marquez character, who's outstanding, and they're trying to do everything they can to see if there's any connection to anybody that's operating right now in the United States.
I have many more questions for you. If you can just stick with
Sure.
me, I want to talk to you about the radicalization of this group and sort of the implications of that. We'll have more with Congressman Will Hurd after a quick break. Experts in the last hour, it was really interesting. They said, if you look in retrospect at this couple, you might say, oh, perhaps there were red flags. There was this interaction with other radicalized individuals in 2012 and the husband. But then they say, you know what, you look back and say that, but maybe there really weren't any red flags. What do you think?
Well, I think this is part of what the investigation into their lives is going to try to tell us, to see were there potential red flags that we could have seen. All the information I think that's been collected to date doesn't say that anything slipped through the cracks. But this scenario, this lone wolf scenario, is probably one of the hardest things to defend against, because if you've never come across the radar of intelligence services, of law enforcement, how do we know that you're a bad person? And this is one area where I think working closely with local law enforcement, private security companies on the ground, where we can tighten up that kind of information sharing that could lead to some of these types of, preventing some of these types of attacks.
And hearing you say that, obviously this is still the big concern, lone wolf attacks, people who are self-radicalized. I think a lot of people are really worried right now that this could happen in their community. Is there a sleeper cell in my neighborhood? Is that unfounded, or do you think that's a justified fear?
It's a justified fear, but know this, the men and women in law enforcement, intelligence agencies, in our diplomatic corps, in our military are working hard to protect us every single day. I spent 9 years as an undercover officer in the CIA. I was the guy in the back alleys at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was in the CIA when 9/11 happened. And if you would have told me it would have been 14 years before another major attack on our homeland, I would have said you were crazy, but there hasn't been because of of the hard work these men and women. We learn from these situations, we get better, and we got to make sure that we get the right information in the right hands so we can keep terrorists on the run and off our shores.
What about the screening process for people who are coming into the U.S.? Tashfeen Malik, for instance, had been discussing jihad, martyrdom before she even made it to the U.S. She did go through an interview process, but obviously a lot of that is self-reporting. Are there changes that could be made to weed people out who may have that inclination?
You know, for someone who's committed to try to get, to try to catch them in an interview that's, 10, 15 minutes long, you can ask questions like, do you believe in jihad? But if someone's committed, they're going to, of course, lie. So how you pick that out, it's about collecting intelligence on the life of an individual, understanding these networks, making sure we're getting all the information we can from all of our partners around the world. One of the things that we did this week in Congress was made updates to the visa waiver programs, the bill that passed the House, partly because a lot of our European allies weren't sharing information with suspected terrorists to us. And again, if we get the right information and build our networks, then our dragnet gets a lot bigger.
I want to ask you about the cyber aspect of this, because there are certainly a lot of recruiters on ISIS or people who may be heading to Syria to fight, and they're talking to each other undeterred on the dark web. They're using encrypted messages. It's very difficult or impossible at this point for the U.S. to crack that code. And I wonder where you think the U.S. is in the process and how far the U.S. has to go in order to delve in there and stop ISIS from using that avenue unimpeded.
Well, one of the things is we got to counter ISIS' use of social media, their narrative. They're getting their message out to hundreds of thousands of people a day, and we got to do a better job of countering that ideology. We also got to be, we can work a little bit more closely with our private sector colleagues on stopping these kinds of attacks. Because if we know that two people are communicating, then there's a lot of more information that we can find out about them to try to stop them. And the fact that ISIS is using these tools, that increases the surface area of attack that we can take advantage of. Back when I was chasing Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan, they were doing things called night letters. They were writing a letter and leaving it on people's doorstep. And you can hit a couple 100 people a night that way. But the way ISIS is leveraging social media, they're hitting tens of thousands of people. And it's an avenue for us to infiltrate them and to stop them overseas in Syria and Iraq.
Yeah, it's really, it is quite something that they are exploiting very much. Congressman Will Hurd, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and giving us your insight on this. The breaking news will be continuing next.